Okay, so this is a short story called The Last 30 Years. Bobby had just sat down to dinner when the phone rang. May answered in the kitchen, and Bobby watched his wife from the table. "Oh dear," she said, frowning. She wrote something on a bill envelope from the stack. "Oh dear," Bobby had learned, could mean anything. Finding an expired coupon, a curse on TV, learning he'd been passed up for general manager at the dealership. "Of course we'll be there," said May. "We love you too." She let the phone rest at her side a moment before hanging up. That was Rodney. Aunt Evelyn passed. Rodney, May's brother, unmarried with no discernible skills, was still living in Danville with the rest of May's family, working part-time folding inserts into the local paper. 6 months ago, May had convinced Bobby to lend him $2,500 for an online PI certification course. Rodney seemed to think it had been some sort of gift, as if they had nothing better to do than pay for lessons on catching cheating spouses and rooting through people's garbage. At Thanksgiving, Bobby had reminded him about the money. Rodney had smiled, slapped Bobby on the shoulder like it was a joke between them. Bobby couldn't remember any Aunt Evelyn. May slumped in her chair. She was wearing a sweater she'd made herself, a Christmas gift for Bobby she'd taken once it no longer fit him. It bunched in the middle, collapsing reindeer into haunches with horns. She ran her hands through her short hair that revealed her earlobes, which Bobby thought looked like pearls. The same haircut as when they'd met at the State Fair Auto Show all those years ago. When they'd first started dating, he hadn't been the youngest man, though he'd acted it, nibbling her ears, pretending to be an oyster. Embarrassing to think about now, but it had driven May wild. "Aunt Evelyn," Bobby said. "Which one was she?" "My mother's sister. Moved to Florida a while back. She gave us tableware for our wedding." Bobby squinted at the ceiling. "You're eating off it now," May said. Bobby looked at his plate, its pattern hidden by 3 servings of vegetables to make up for a lack of entree. Almost 30 years, May had chucked steak or a porterhouse ready when he walked through the door. They'd never been rich, but even after May said she could no longer keep up with the daycare, they'd been able to buy a decent cut of meat. Then the owner's kid had taken over at the dealership and gouged Bobby's commission, beginning the monthly conversation about whether to put off the electricity or car payment. An excuse to eat healthier, May had said. The vegetable medley era. "We'll have to go to Danville for the service," she said, staring at the table between them. Bobby scooped potatoes on his fork. "There's a will reading, too." "A will?" He chewed a moment. "Aunt Evelyn liked you, right? You were a good niece?" "I think so," May said. "I was at her house a lot growing up." May found Bobby's hand. She never had children either. She squeezed, reminding Bobby of the afternoon a lifetime ago, holding hands in the doctor's office. A year they'd been trying. Bobby had learned the names of his neighbor's children, installed the basketball hoop in the driveway. Any kid of his would be a natural. They hadn't rushed into it, had waited to buy a place, put a little away besides, to get things right. Varicocele, they called it, Bobby had told friends later, once he could say the word without his tongue catching in his jaw. Fancy word for no dirty diapers. Bobby pulled away and flattened peas with his fork. May kept her hand on the table, cupping air. "Aunt Evelyn spoiled Rodney and me rotten," she continued, looking past Bobby, where the wall clock ticked out seconds. "I should have visited, but it's hard enough to make it to Danville." "But no one else visited her either," Bobby said. "Rodney went." "To Florida? With whose money?" "Aunt Evelyn bought his ticket. I read you his postcards, remember?" "Fucking Rodney," Bobby said through a mouthful of potatoes. "What was that?" Bobby swallowed. "Might have to work that day." Visiting Danville on holidays, Bobby thought, was often enough. He was convinced May's family added another member every couple months, one on every street, each requiring a stop. "It's Saturday. You have off this Saturday." "You always had a good memory." "I know," May said. "I remember that." She laughed, remembered why she was sad, and started crying. They arrived in Danville just before the service. As they drove, May pointed out changes to the town. The pawn shop that had been Custard Castle, Rye's diner that had been Debbie's, and Al's before that. The public swimming pool, now a parking lot. where Kitty Lipinski had dared May to climb the lifeguard tower to kiss Troy Hopper. She'd nearly made it before slipping and hitting her chin on the wooden scaffolding. Still had the scar. Sometimes she ran her finger along its groove. Each time they were there, May noted what this or that used to be. Back when she'd been on homecoming court and dating Reggie DeLam, a linebacker who'd played pro for a year before the concussions caught up with him. Bobby and May saw him on commercials, endorsing Phipps sporting goods. It was the llama lure when I knew him, May would say. Nothing special then, nothing special now. Which Bobby appreciated, though he could feel her tighten at the ex-hero's first words, a hesitation just longer than a blink before she spoke. At the funeral home, May's family clustered at the side door smoking. Bobby walked, hands in his pockets, while May ran to hug everyone. He winced when he noticed her dress, old enough to order a beer, stretched across her backside, underwear lines showing against the thinning fabric. After Rodney's call, she stared at the checkbook an hour before pulling the dress from the back of the closet. An oldie but a goodie, she'd said. New dress or not, May was still a knockout. He remembered her first noticing her at the auto show, the curve of neck below her hair seeming like more skin than he'd ever seen. He'd led her away from the boyfriend to give her a tour. Dumb kid hadn't even glanced up from the Mustang's window sticker. On the third loop around the showroom, she'd taken Bobby's arm. If her boyfriend wanted to ride home, she said, he could buy that Mustang or a bus ticket. May looked his way as if he'd said the words out loud, pausing between hugs to smile. Bobby hadn't known he was smiling back until he saw Rodney and felt his face fall. May's brother was standing just outside the circle, not smoking. He liked to tell anyone who'd listen how he'd given it up. Bobby himself had cut down to 3 or 4 a week, but he kept the pack on him for the familiar shape in his pocket. He tapped out a cigarette as he approached the circle, waited for Rodney to say hello, then let Rodney wait while he bent toward the flame. Good to see you, Rodney said, blinking at the smoke. How's the beat, gumshoe? Bobby said. Rodney crinkled his brow as Bobby watched and smoked. Rodney's face slowly straightened as he understood. Good one, Rodney said. He turned to Uncle Harold on his left. How's the beat, he says. May touched Bobby's shoulder. He flicked the cigarette and followed her inside. The smell of antiseptic and day-too-old flowers brought Bobby back to his last funeral, his father's 5 years ago. His mother's had been a year before that. The services were 3,000 miles apart, but otherwise just as full of friends, co-workers, and in-laws he'd never met. His parents had held together long enough to see him through school, divorced when he'd moved out, eventually married other people. At each wake, Bobby searched photos tacked to poster boards for the three of them together happy, sometime he'd forgotten. But the faces beside his parents were unfamiliar. Lives begun again at 50, Bobby's age when they died. A do-over, his father told him on a rare call that went beyond baseball or the weather. Why did I wait so damn long? They filed past the rows of chairs to the open casket. To Bobby's surprise, he recognized Aunt Evelyn. She was the woman with thinning orange hair, smiling politely in a corner and blowing on a teacup. Bobby remembered the children daring one another to see who could sit in her lap the longest. May's cousin Cheryl's kids that long ago? He and May would have been pushing 40, but still young enough to look forward more than back. She looks just like I remember, May said. I should have visited. Bobby put his arm around her and she fell against him. You loved her. His voice seemed to rise and fall in all the wrong places. I'm sure she knew that. May nodded. After a moment, she wiped her face with her palms, excused herself. Bobby leaned in to get a better look. Mima Death, the kids had called her. Aunt Evelyn had overheard them once. Bobby had seen the flash in her eyes, but she'd said nothing, her expression otherwise unchanged. Her smile was gone now, but someone had dyed her hair and she had color in her cheeks, natural looking, as if she could open her eyes, give Bobby a wink, and return to the ruse. Got all the way to Florida only to be sent back, he said. But you look good, there's that at least. The will reading was at Cheryl's, and from the number of cars, it looked like Bobby and May were the last to arrive. Inside, the bereaved had tripled, with some balancing clipboards and briefcases. Cheryl passed carrying a veggie tray, pausing just long enough to point out a man near a table spread with other deli platters. The lawyer, she said. Rodney waved from the back row of chairs in the living room, stopping to hold his arm across the seats beside him when another couple approached. May led Bobby in the opposite direction of the food, taking the seat next to her brother, who had a full plate in his lap. "Be right back," Bobby said, thumbing the table. He turned just as the lawyer took his place out front. "Welcome," the man said, motioning for everyone to sit. "This won't take long, and we can get back to honoring Evelyn." Bobby sank in his chair as the lawyer began with a list of charities, nodding when one of the men or women with the clipboard lifted a hand. Each name was followed by a dollar amount that made Bobby raise his eyebrows. "What exactly did Aunt Evelyn do in Florida?" he asked May. "There was a settlement with the post office," May whispered, "years and years ago. Hit while mailing a letter. She used a wheelchair for months." Bobby imagined the force of the truck, the letters flying, how he'd roll himself to the mailbox with a smile to collect his settlement, all the cars he'd sell with the sympathy. Hell, he'd never have to sell a car again. "To my nephew Rodney," read the lawyer, "I leave $20,000 and my house in Florida." Rodney closed his eyes, nodded. He dipped a carrot in ranch and pushed it into his mouth. "Holy shit," Bobby said. The lawyer looked in Bobby's direction, cleared his throat. "For my niece May, I leave plot 241. "Plot 241, Bobby whispered. May put a hand to her mouth. She and Rodney smiled at each other. As a girl, she said, I got it into my head I wanted to be buried next to her. Told her that more than once. She would hear that and just laugh. May drew out the word. I'd forgotten all about it. Bobby's chest pinched. It's a burial plot? Right next to Aunt Evelyn's, I bet, May said. Excellent location, Rodney said. So we get holes in the ground in Danville? One of the clipboards turned around long enough to look Bobby up and down. Hole, Rodney said. It's only one plot. Plot 241. I could look into buying another, Rodney said. Make it a pair. How about just the money I loaned you, Bobby said. What would you say to that? Ha, said Rodney. Brothers don't loan each other money. He clapped Bobby's shoulder. Bobby stared at the chair in front of him until the final name was called and loaded a plate with cold cuts and made for the back door. He passed the kitchen, where Cheryl had the lawyer cornered. What about Becca and Jason? Bobby heard her say as he slid the door behind him. They were like grandkids. Bobby walked until he reached the fence line, surveyed the strip mall across the street. The second-hand store where May had pieced together high school Halloween costumes, the TV vacuum repair shop where she'd worked the register, the billiards hall where she'd had her first and last beer. Worked for hours, she said. He'd never been able to get her to try again. Penny for your thoughts? Bobby dropped his bologna, turned to find Rodney stripping a celery stalk with his incisors. Let me ask you something, Bobby said. You drink your first beer at that pool hall? Sure did. Didn't happen to work at Rich's TV and back, did you? Summers as a kid, house calls. Wish I could get that gig back. Uh-huh. Bobby offered his plate. Rodney mouthed thank you before plucking a cold cut. The commute would be a killer, Bobby said. How do you mean? Well, you've got a house in Florida now. Sure, Rodney swallowed, but home's here. People I need, who need me. Not May. We don't worry about May, he said. She's got you. Bobby studied Rodney's face, but the smile looked genuine enough. Still, he couldn't shake the dull pulse in his stomach. The same feeling he carried for months after he and May no longer talked about having, not having kids. In those moments when food was chewed unceasingly, a napkin left at the mouth too long, he imagined what May was turning over, what words she would use to say, your fault, or I'm leaving, or I don't love you. How different everything might have been had she known what he couldn't give. Bobby had kept the doctor's handouts in his dresser, procedures and possible complications, bullet points and payment plans and pictures that made his gut curl. He hadn't needed to decide right away. Success rates were improving every year. Now and then the brochures would move, tiny creases spreading from their spines. But outside the doctor's office, May had said it was his choice, left it at that. The one time she'd asked about adopting, he'd waved away the thought. Years later, too many, He surprised them both by repeating her question. May smiled weakly, smoothed the gray in his temples with a thumb. Bobby listened to goodbyes on the front walk, engines turning over, people moving on. He thought he heard May call from the patio door, but when he looked, there was no one. May will be wondering where I am, he said. You don't look so good. Rodney lifted a hand toward Bobby's forehead. Bobby ducked the palm, started for the house. Could be the cold cuts, Rodney called after. Given your diet, your body's probably rejecting the meat. Bobby rolled what was left on his plate into a ball, held it above his head, then dropped it down the hatch. Bobby stood at the showroom doors thinking about his last cigarette. In the past 7 hours, he'd spoken with a pair of fidgety newlyweds and a retired notary who'd been in 4 times in the last 2 weeks. Combined, they'd taken 2 pricing glossies and a complimentary calendar before saying they needed more time. He reached for his breast pocket as the general manager, Hal's reflection appeared beside him in the glass. Slow day, said Hal, head following the notary as he drove off the lot. Hal smoothed his tie against his shirt, 2 sizes too big. His father's shirt, Bobby guessed. Yes, sir, Bobby said, letting his hand fall. He cringed at addressing someone more than 3 decades his junior by the title he himself received only from waiters and telemarketers. Not much we can do when people don't walk in the door, is there? No, sir. Though I'm not imagining things, am I? Those were real live people you were talking to. He waited for Bobby to nod. We're not here to hand out glossies like they grow on trees. Hal stopped himself. Though, technically they do grow on trees. They're paper. Point is, you're a salesman. At least that's what your pay stub says. Hal turned to wink at Dennis, a college friend of Hal's and floor manager. More than once, Dennis had trailed Bobby's clients off the floor, passing out business cards in the lot. Hal leaned in. You're paid on commission, he said, not lowering his voice. Which means if you don't sell cars, you don't get paid. And when you don't get paid, I don't get paid. Hal put his arm around Bobby and pivoted. Take a look at Fred there, he said, nodding to Fred Munson, senior sales associate, who had helped Bobby learn the ropes all those years ago. Fred was peeling an orange at his station. As if on cue, he dropped the orange on the floor. Bobby and Hal watched it roll under his desk. 1 car last month, Hal said. Fred won't be with us much longer. Fred and his wife had invited Bobby to dinner when he'd gotten the job. Fred's kids had been long gone, but twice Linda had called Bobby their son's name. Neither she nor Fred had noticed, and Bobby hadn't corrected her. He was here when your father opened the doors, Bobby said. People like Fred, they respect him. You can't deposit respect. Hal jabbed Bobby's shoulder before walking over to Fred, who was feeling for the orange under his chair. Hal bent for the fruit, set it in Fred's palm. Fred stood, offering his other hand, and Hal showed a fist bump. Fred, already leaning in, stopped, arm dangling. Bobby looked away as Fred curled his fingers into a loose claw. May monitored the stir-fry at the stove. Maybe we could ask Rodney for help, she said. Bobby let his face slip through his hands, his forehead hitting the table with a dull thud. Oh, don't be so dramatic. May hummed as she waltzed to a drawer, took a serving spoon, and spun back to the stove. For years, she talked about dance classes at the rec. With $20,000, Bobby could rename the center after her and still have enough left over to stock the freezer with fillet cuts stacked like poker chips. Or put down a down payment on the abandoned dealership across the street. It didn't even have to be cars. Bobby was a natural salesman. Given the right conditions, he could sell anything. Bobby jerked his head from the table. I could sell the plot. Who'd want to buy a grave next to Aunt Evelyn, May said, and kept on humming. If something costs money, it can make money, and good plots cost money. May finished her song. She slid the vegetables onto plates and carried them to the table. I feel a little weird selling a gift. It's not like you're thinking of using it, right? May speared a piece of broccoli and took a bite. Bobby waited while she chewed. Don't be silly, she said, finally. You'd rather it go to waste? No, I guess not. Then that's something I can do something about. After dinner, Bobby called Rodney with the offer. He talked for 10 minutes, describing what he remembered of the cemetery, the well-manicured lawn, the gated entrance, plenty of trees providing shade for loved ones. He used every trick he could think of, speed talking, repeating Rodney's name, throwing in a curse every now and again to show just how damn passionate he was about the product. Wow, I really appreciate you thinking of me, Rodney said, but I've already decided I want my ashes launched into space. Bobby hung up. He'd placed an ad in the Danville paper, but in 2 weeks no one had called, and he was running out of money to spend trying to sell a hole in the ground. Bobby picked up his desk phone, checked for a dial tone, put the phone back. The showroom doors chimed, and 4 grade schoolers entered, leaving their bicycles against the windows. Hal stood in his office overlooking the floor, motioning for Bobby to get rid of them. Bobby stepped out from his desk, the boys and girls stopping to look at their shoes when he saw him coming. I cut the best deals in town, Bobby said, but I don't think it'll be enough. How about coming back in a few years? Well, one of the girls started, tapping a sneaker toe on the marble. The door rang again, and in walked the newlyweds from a few days before. Dennis met them on the way to Bobby's desk, showed them the seats in front of his. Bobby rubbed a hand over his face. Well, a boy said, trying his luck. He glanced at a flyer in his hand, sucked in a breath as if to speak, then did it again without releasing the first. Bobby motioned to the paper. May I? The boy nodded and shoved it at Bobby. Project, buying a car. Use math in the real world. You save half a year's salary, but remember to spend wisely. If you want a convertible, you might not be able to afford leather seats. Bobby halved his paycheck. Vinyl interior, he figured. Power steering, a sunroof if he didn't spring for heated seats. Nearly all of it standard, even before he'd started at the dealership. He handed back the paper. How many students in your class? The kids looked at each other. More than just you, right? A couple dozen? The taller of the 2 girls nodded. Bobby went to the display of pricing glossies, returning with whatever was on the shelves. Open up your packs. He dropped them inside. Will that do it? They nodded. Now get out of here, he said, watching Hal trip his way downstairs. One of your classmates needs to tell me about trees. The house was dark when Bobby returned. He flipped the switch, nothing, and launched his briefcase at the front door. Even empty, it managed to put a dent the width of a silver dollar in the wood. Bobby ran a thumb over the mark. What was that? May said from the back. Settling in. Just watch your step. Electricity's out. Bobby walked to the storage room, leaned against the door jamb, and watched May push a cardboard box into a corner with the others. I called and promised to put a check in the mail, she said. Power should be back any minute. What's all this? I'm looking for my sewing kit. What for? I was thinking I could publish my own ad. Help out by taking a few alterations. We don't need any help, Bobby said. He walked to the kitchen and May followed. Just for now, until sales pick up again. Get us through the next couple bills. Bobby opened the curtains over the sink, letting in enough light to see into the fridge. He collected the mayo and mustard and cheese slices, the bread from the box. I've been thinking about something else, May said, pulling down a plate from the cupboard. Bobby pulled 2 slices of grain and flax, scattering seeds on the counter. About moving, maybe. Moving. Why not? Rodney talked to the manager of the Danville dealership, and he's looking to hire. Danville. See, May said, that detective money went to good use. Rodney found something after all. She gave a nervous laugh, swept the seeds with her hand. Leave it, Bobby said. I've just been thinking since the funeral. We've got family there. You've got family there. They're yours, too. Bobby looked out the window, watched the wind lift the basketball net against the rust-bubbled rim. He reminded himself often to take down the hoop, haul it away. Instead, he would spend the afternoon shooting free throws. Say we had kids to pull out of school, Bobby said, facing May. I suppose then you wouldn't be thinking of moving. They'd be out of the house by now, maybe with kids of their own. Grandparents. Something else they'd missed. May reached for Bobby's arm. He brushed her away. Bobby, May said, we've been happy. That's thanks to you. But if there's a chance we could be happy in Danville, too. She reached again, and he grabbed her hand, met her eyes, let her go. Damn it, Bobby, I came here for you, for your work, so you can do me the courtesy of giving this some thought. He turned to the fridge, scanned the shelves as if he'd forgotten something. May was so quiet he wondered if she was still there. I'll get the candle, she said finally, sprinkling the seeds over the trash on her way out. Bobby leaned into the fridge, let what was left of the cool air run over him. He struggled to read the labels until he remembered there was nothing he was looking for, realized anyway that he was blocking the light. Bobby watched Hal toss a foam basketball through the hoop over his door. He'd lob from behind his desk, rise for a ball, and sit down for the next shot. It made Bobby tired, and he caught his head drooping. He took a complimentary coffee outside and lit a cigarette, his third of the day. When a woman approached the doors, Bobby smiled, holding in the smoke as she passed. She looked at the cigarette, screwed up her face, and entered the showroom. Bobby exhaled against the glass as Dennis greeted her on the floor. A breeze floated Bobby's tie off his stomach. Catching himself in the window, he hooked the tie, held it flat at his buckle. Robert, he said, a pleasure. Have I got the perfect automobile for you? He smiled, but it came back a wince. His phone was ringing when he went inside. He splashed coffee on his shirt, making it in time. Robert Duffy speaking. Mr. Duffy, this is Ted Walterson calling from Danville. The ad, Bobby remembered. He almost hadn't renewed it, congratulated himself for taking the chance. Thanks for calling, Ted. Seeing as it's a family plot, my wife and I, going on 30 years next month, want to make sure it doesn't just go to anyone. But you sound like a good man, Ted, and well, damn it if I'm putting the cart before the horse here, but I say if you want the plot, it's yours. Mr. Duffy, I'm calling from Danville Automotive. I spoke with Rodney. Seems you have quite the experience selling cars, and we're looking to expand our team. Bobby dropped the receiver to his thigh, the man's voice floating up to him, faint, miles away. Dennis and the woman passed his desk, shook hands at the door. When she'd left, Dennis spun toward Bobby, made a pistol with his fingers and pulled the trigger. Bobby turned back to the show floor. Across the street, the abandoned dealership, the previous owner's name outlined in flecking paint, the aluminum letters scrapped years before. Bobby tried picturing Duffy posted above the wide windows, but couldn't see beyond the key-scored glass and half-hearted graffiti. He raised the phone. Which is why we think you feel right at home here, the man said. Danville, where Rodney, Troy Hopper, and Aunt Evelyn were waiting. And plot 241, possibly with his own next to it someday. Bobby imagined being lowered into the earth alongside May, the dye in their hair fading, clothes growing too large for their bodies. But if he kept to the diet, started shooting hoops again, he might have another 30 years. A whole other life. What May wanted. What he could give. Bobby pressed the receiver to his ear. I'm listening, he said.